Alex here with a legal nuts and bolts video on interpreting court orders. And I'm not talking about covering a topic where I sort of help you understand the court's orders. In fact, that's going to be really something that comes down to understanding legal writing and understanding the terms that are used and stuff like that. This video is about the interpretation of court orders on appeal. In other words, how to leverage the language of a court order to win your appeal. This doesn't actually come up very often. Most of the time, the Supreme Court or other appellate courts are interpreting statutes and court rules, sometimes case law, to determine whether or not the court order itself is, illegal, needs to be overturned on appeal. If something is wrong with the order, it needs to be vacated, either in whole or in part. But every now and then, the court will make an order that is based on one of its previous orders. And this could have to do with contempt of court. In fact, it's probably one of the more common situations. But there's an example recently that I helped someone with, and that had to do with custodial designation. That's a big deal. The individual in question is a father, and his custody order, or it was the decree, I think they were married, so that would be a decree of divorce. I'm not sure. Whether it's a decree or a judgment doesn't matter. What matters is that the contents of that order specified that if the mother moved back to the city in which he lived, that the parties would share joint custody. If the mother did not move back, then the father would retain primary physical custody, the child would go to school where he resides, and the mother would be reduced to visitation in order to pay child support. So this ended up coming up on appeal. The interpretation of this order called into question what kind of custody did this father have. And what happened was the mother refused to move back. She decided to stay in the city that she had moved to, and she decided to file a motion to modify child custody based on changed circumstances. What happened was the standard that needed to be relied upon varied depending on whether the father had primary physical custody or whether the parties had joint physical custody. And what I'm talking about I have covered in a video titled Change of Circumstances. In Nevada, this is not the same in every state, but in Nevada, there is a legal principle or doctrine called res judicata, and there is a statute that is based on res judicata principles, and that statute applies in child custody situations. It basically states, and again, this is just Nevada, other states are different, it states that in Nevada, you cannot bring up issues that have been brought up prior to show that a change of circumstances has occurred, and this only applies in situations where one of the parents has primary physical custody. It does not apply in situations where both parties share joint physical custody. So the court had a curious situation before it. The court had to determine what legal standard to apply at that hearing, and to do so, the court needed to interpret its previous court order. I would like to take this opportunity to tell my viewers that I could have sworn I talked about this in a previous video, but I have scoured my entire repository and I can't find any videos where I cover this topic. Maybe it was one of those things that I covered in a live stream, and so for that reason I'm having this deja vu feeling that I've already talked about this. But if any of my viewers has seen a video where I already covered this topic, please let me know and I'll pull this video down. But I've been looking for a good half hour, so I really apologize if I'm covering this topic again for a second time, but I stress that it was probably in a live stream and so I don't actually have a dedicated topic on it. Anyway, the court decided that because a specific date had not occurred yet, the parties still shared joint physical custody. The date in question was the date at which, I should clarify. It wasn't that the date hadn't occurred. It was that the date had occurred after the date that the mom filed the motion. So what the court was saying was, mom filed a motion prior to this trigger date. I need to clarify what that is. The trigger date was the date upon which the mother had to make a decision. It was the date upon which she had to move back or stay away. The court decided that it was going to interpret its previous court order such that since mom had not moved back, or since that date had not occurred when she filed her motion to modify custody, the standard that was going to apply was going to be the standard based on joint physical custody. The father interpreted the court order differently. The father decided that the court order wasn't so much about the trigger date at all. What was in question was the best interest of the child and whether the parents lived close to each other or not. In other words, if the parties were not going to live near each other, it was in the best interest of the child for him to have primary physical custody. If the parties were going to live near each other, then it was in the best interest of the child for the parties to share joint physical custody. The judge ruled against him, applied the other standard, and it is now on appeal in Nevada in the Supreme Court. And they've actually scheduled oral arguments, which shows that it's a big deal because they don't really do that very often. In fact, it's probably less than 1% of the time that happens. I wonder what the exact percentage is on that. So anyway, I had looked into this, not necessarily just because of that case. I had kind of looked into it a little bit in my own case because contempt of court came up all the time in my case. And I was wondering how the court interpreted its own court orders. One of the thoughts that I had, and I think one of the thoughts that most people assume, is the court drafted the order. So the court can decide to interpret its own order that it drafted however it feels like doing it. Because, hey, if I'm the judge and I wrote the order, I'm the one that gets to say what it meant. Well, the Supreme Court of Nevada does not agree, thankfully, because that would be such a bad situation, because a court could just decide, well, I like this conclusion, so if I want to reach that conclusion and I need to interpret my previous orders in a weird way to get to that point, then I'm going to go ahead and do that. Unfortunately, some judges do that. It's not the right thing to do, but they just do it because it's easier. I've said many times on this channel, there's a difference between the right thing and the easy thing. Sometimes they line up. Sometimes the easy thing is the right thing. Sometimes they don't. And in those situations, sometimes the judge will do the wrong thing just because it wants to do the easy thing. It's easier. It's less work. Anyway, there are two main, I guess you could call them points of analysis as to how the Supreme Court looks at the interpretation of a court's previous orders. There are going to be all sorts of nooks and crannies and details, and other states are going to work differently, and I want to make it clear to the viewers that I'm giving you sort of an idea as to what to look for, but make sure you do your own research, because number one, you're not in Nevada, or maybe you are, but even if you are, I'm not covering all the nooks and crannies and the exceptions. But if you aren't, you need to especially take a look at this because your state may have a different view. So, first thing that the Supreme Court does is they look to see if the language of the order is plain. And what they mean by that is if you cannot draw two or more meaningful interpretations from that language. If you can't, it's plain. And if it's plain, it must be followed. Period. The end. That's it. They apply the same rule under or for statutory construction, which I have a separate video on. Some states call this statutory interpretation. Nevada calls it statutory construction. They may use the term synonymously, but in that video I talk about the plain language rule, and that is basically what I just talked about when it comes to interpreting court orders as well. Now, if you can draw more than one meaning from the language in the court's order, it is considered to be ambiguous, and so different rules apply when it comes to interpreting ambiguous provisions in a court's order. First of all, they actually do take into consideration the intent of the parties. So if you and your ex read an ambiguous provision a certain way, then that is going to be what controls going forward. So the actions that you take and the understanding that you demonstrate to the court as to an ambiguous provision, as far as what I've done research on, that controls the court's interpretation going forward. In other words, the court can't just decide which one to choose. The court actually has to do an inquiry. The court actually has to ask you and your opponent, what did you think this meant? And how were you guys treating this provision? Once the court gets to the conclusion as to how you guys read that provision, that's what's going to control going forward, or control depending on the issue that's in front of the court now. This has to do specifically with interpretation. That's all I've talked about throughout this video, but there's also something that they refer to as clarification. If the court is clarifying an order, that's apparently different, and none of those rules that I mentioned apply. When it comes to clarifying an order, the court is free to clarify it as it chooses. So I haven't seen very clear examples as to what this is, but I have seen other situations where the court entered an order that needed to be more specific, and I think that is what they're referring to when they use this term clarifying or clarification. So, for example, maybe the court enters an order where you have a visitation schedule, and then the court has a separate provision that says that you are supposed to get, I don't know, we'll say New Year's Day. And that New Year's Day happens to land on your opponent or your exes. I hate to call them opponents, but when you're in high conflict cases, that's really what they are, since you're battling it out in court. But anyway, your ex has the child on that New Year's Day, but according to the court's order, that is, you know, your holiday, so you're supposed to have the child, and so you have a little bit of a conflicting situation there. The court can apparently, my understanding is, clarify that, and maybe what the court can do is say, well, if you are getting the child on a holiday that isn't ordinarily your time, then you pick the child up at 9 a.m. and drop the child off at 9 p.m. That's not really altering the order in any way. You're still getting New Year's Day. You know, it's just now the court has clarified how it works, because maybe there was an argument as to when you do the pickup and the drop off. The court order was enforceable as it was before, but maybe it was inconvenient, or maybe it was a source of conflict because your ex couldn't agree as to, you know, what time you can get the child. Maybe they said something ridiculous like you can get the child from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. and that's your holiday. You know, this is the kind of stuff that the court can do on clarifying an order, and apparently those restrictions that I went over just do not apply to that. But when it comes to interpretation of a court order in a way that controls an outcome, that's different, and the court is bound by existing precedent, at least in Nevada, as to how it can interpret those court's orders. So I wanted to do this video for my viewers to let them know that this does sometimes come up on appeal, and it never came up in my case, but it has come up on a few cases every now and then that people have approached me with, and I honestly found it to be a little surprising, because I thought that, and this isn't good, I don't agree with it, but I just assumed that since the judge wrote the order, they can just decide how to interpret it, just however they feel like doing it. To me, that was a concern I had. I was worried about that. And I was pleasantly surprised to see, having done a little bit of research, that that's not the case, and that if the judge does not abide by the case law on how to interpret its previous orders, the Supreme Court of Nevada will and does overturn the decision of that particular judge who made the mistake. So if anyone has any questions, definitely post something down in the comments below. If this has ever happened to you, where the interpretation of a previous court order came up on an issue as to what the court was going to order, you know, when you were in front of the court right then and there. If that's happened in your case, if that's come up and, you know, you had a bad outcome, post that in the comments below. Let the viewers know, especially if the judge just kind of decided, well, I wrote the order, so I'm just going to decide what I think it means. If that happened to you, post that down there so that other viewers can see that this is a thing, that this does happen to people, and this is something to be, you know, aware of. So yeah, with that said, I will definitely end this video now, and I will see you guys next time.